Most people tend to think that loneliness is an issue for outside the workplace. But what if it's already happening in our offices, insipidly shaping how employees think, create, and if they stay? That's what we'll be discussing on this episode of Connected at Work. I'm Simone Heng, a human connection specialist and award-winning author of Let's Talk About Loneliness. So for a lot of people, the subject of loneliness may seem like purely a mental health issue or a personal issue. But the truth is, loneliness in the workplace has been costing US organizations alone $154 billion. Now, this figure is specifically related to attrition that comes from individuals not having a workplace best buddy. Logical, right? You go to work because you love one of your co-workers, and the two of you therefore bond together, then feel more bonded to the team itself, and the team itself then feels more bonded to the workplace and its mission. But what happens when people are lonely and they don't have connection at work, which is what we're seeing on the rise because of remote onboarding or from the hybrid workplace, is they have no incentive to really feel like they want to get up and go to work if the work itself has become a little bit unstimulating or has taken a little bit of dip in engagement. That loss of engagement, that isolation, and that lack of motivation and purpose is affecting productivity, retention, and creativity in the workplace. This is now no longer just a personal issue. And to be frank, we're human beings, so what happens outside of work always influences what's happening at work anyway. A lot of the reason why we're losing that kind of engagement and connection at work is to do with the changing state of work. You know, a lot of interactions have been done on Slack. A lot of it is emails, remote work. And guess what? As human beings, we didn't evolve to connect that way. In fact, a lot of research shows that when we are connecting purely on digital means, it's almost like reading a book where the text has been redacted. A lot of that impulse, that social nuance that you get from when you just meet someone for the first time, and you can build trust because your brain is taking in lots of different social cues like eye contact, vocal expression, facial expression. That's of course lost on Slack. That is of course lost even on video where a lot of the body language is cut out. And so for all of these reasons, it's harder to connect. And then with the rise of the volatility in the world that we're seeing, people's increased cost of living, there's an exhaustion, there's a fatigue happening. And then you're going to tell people you also need to go into work and make more of an effort to connect with your colleagues. I think people have just reached a limit, personally and professionally, around making that effort. And so the first thing that's going to suffer, of course, is the workplace human connections. So is loneliness in the world getting worse over time? Look, we've actually been getting lonelier and lonelier far earlier than most people imagine. It's only recently become a topic because people like me wrote books on it. But to be honest, from the moment we started designing our cities differently, no longer around a central piazza or a third space like a mosque or a church or a synagogue, when we stopped doing that, disconnection already started to seep in. And in the 1970s, Robert Putnam wrote a very, very famous book called Bowling Alone about the dissolution of participation in civic life in America. This is where people stopped joining their bowling clubs or their Rotary clubs or their hobby groups. And this is a trend that has just increased and increased. What we're seeing now is a mass sense of disconnection that coincided with the rise of, smartphones and social media. And that's probably what most people have been seeing a lot in the news. I'll give you a really good example how the current volatility of the world, and at the time of speaking, this is 2026, I'm going to give you an example of what has been happening to loneliness societally. We now have young people in places like Japan, Korea, but even in Singapore where I'm based, choosing to be what are called, recluses. They don't want to go to school. They don't want to socialize. They are not interested in even going out anywhere beyond their bedroom. And this is to do with the volatility of the world, the increase in the cost of living, the climate change anxiety, and the displacement of jobs because of AI. So these young people think, what on earth is the point of me getting up out of bed? I'm disconnected from life, and therefore I am disconnected from other people. So a sense of purpose is important, and then a sense of engagement in your family life and beyond your family life, your community life, and so on and so on. Now, this is something that is really, really worrying and interesting that has happened really in the last couple of decades. And so if you want me to answer, do I think loneliness is increasing? Yes. In terms of these particular situations, yes. So what can leaders therefore do to improve engagement in the workplace and connection at work, getting people rallying around the mission of work? I think companies now have to do more than ever to retain top talent, more than they've ever had to do before in terms of providing flexibility. Because remember, a lonely employee is not just lonely with their connections at work. They could also be lonely to do with their connections at home. So providing them flexibility to lean into fulfilling connections at home, which is what we call intimate connection. Intimate connection are those people that love you warts and all. You can be really vulnerable with them. And it's usually characterized as the 5 people you cohabitate with. That research is Professor Robin Dunbar. So if your employee has that satiation of connection at home, they're going to be way better at work. So giving them the flexibility to do 4 work days, 3 work days a week might be something to look at, or the flexibility to, work from home if they need to. I think more and more organizations have to allow that, even though I know a lot of them are pushing for everyone to go in work. Connection happens in circles, if you like, orbits. So it's not that your work connections will necessarily come first, but your work connections from an organization's point of view, the health of those, absolutely vital to getting projects over the line with a high level of quality. So a connection first mindset is important. Firstly, leaders need to understand this is an issue, which is exactly why I've created this content. They need to understand that this is an issue that affects their bottom line. And once you have that realization, you can't step away from that. It's an acknowledgement that it is in the way of work getting done. And the next thing is to have a connection first mindset. I'm going to give you a really good example of how this works. So Dr. Dennis Profit of Virginia University did a study. It's called the Geographical Perception of a Hill Slant. And in it, he got individuals who were perceiving they were about to go on a travel up a very steep hill. They were shown a picture of how steep this hill was, and they were wired up, fMRI and all of those things. And they had to guess the incline of that hill while they were being measured. Then next to them, they were placed a high quality, high trust human connection. And they were asked to estimate, again, what they thought the steepness of that hill slant was. And every time, when in the presence of a high quality connection, they perceived that hill, that challenge, to be less steep, so more surmountable. And so why was that? Well, what the scans revealed was that we as individuals, we do not take into account just our own talents, right? We don't take into account our own strength, our own quickness, our youth, our energy. These are what the researchers call bioenergetic resources. So we don't take those into account if we are next to a high quality, high trust connection. We count their talents, their strengths, their intelligence, or their energy as part of our own, therefore making us feel we have more support and those challenges are less intimidating, if you like. So as leaders, you can hire the best team you want, super highly skilled, super intelligent, super fast, super quick. But if they're disconnected from each other, you will never squeeze the full potential out of your team. I think that is some really profound science. We really perceive ourselves, because as social creatures, we're baked in our DNA to connect. We perceive ourselves as a part of a whole and that we are all connected. That's why almost all the major faiths in the world say that we're all one. The science backs that up. So if you would like to get the best out of the people you spend months interviewing and filtering and hiring for, connection has to be part of that. So now that we've acknowledged that loneliness is actually an issue in the workplace, what can be done about this and what happens if you don't do anything about it? I'm going to tell you a scenario that I'm sure your HR department would roll their eyes at just thinking about. But imagine you're hiring young people, Gen Z, into the workplace, and you want them to perform and show up engaged. And because it is their first time at work and they might not feel like they're super part of the team yet, you could see them quitting very early on and then you consistently having to rehire. So great exercise is when you have onboarded a new person, within the first month, ask them how they're doing, check in with them, ask them if they have felt a moment of connection or connection to the team. And then you do that again in 3 months, 6 months. And very soon you'll get some data on where is the first moment, the first marker of connection for that individual. How was it made? In what context was it made? And then how can you duplicate, multiply that for all the new people that you're onboarding? Because without it, the amount of money of that attrition, that early quitting, that interviewing, searching and rehiring, that is ultimately a pain for people. Now, worst case scenario, disconnected workplaces can also be toxic workplaces. We've all seen the famous story of Boeing. They were doing so well, and then they had some issues with disconnection in the workplace, changing the location of their headquarters. And these miscommunications and toxic disconnection within the workplace ended up with many, many people being killed in a huge plane crash. That's a lack of human connection issue. So that would be worst case scenario. Loneliness isn't just a feeling, it's a signal. And if leaders don't sit up and take notice of this problem, by the time it has sabotaged their workplace culture, it could be too late.